If you have a jelly roll in a couple of hours, then you can make this super fun striped quilt behind me. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to tackle a super fun, super fast quilt right behind me. It's about 48 by 64. All you'll need for this quilt is one jelly roll, and you need 40 strips to make the quilt behind me. Now each block is about 9.5 by 16 finished. You will only need this jelly roll to make the top. You will need about 2/3 of a yard for the binding, and then obviously whatever backing you want to use as well. But just one top, one jelly roll, super fast. I made this in a couple hours, so let's go make another one. So after some thought and playing around with my jelly rolls, this is the jelly roll I have decided to use for my quilt today. And this will be for my very rainbow loving little boy. So most jelly rolls come with 40 pieces. This one happens to be 41 pieces. So each 2 strips will give you one block that is roughly 10 by 16.5 inches, and it will finish at about 9.5 by 16. So I need to remove just one piece from my jelly roll. Now if yours has 40 pieces, then you're set. You just need an even number of strips to make the blocks work out. So I'm just going to open this up, and oh, this is like the best part of opening up a jelly roll. I need to take that rubber band off and then unfurl it. So nice. So since this is for my little boy, I'm going to take out the lightest pink color, and we will just save that for another day, a little scrappy project in the future. So I want to arrange mine in rainbow order. So basically I'm going to be using them kind of as they came out of this roll. So if you are using a jelly roll more like this, where there are kind of color families and there's like 5 or 6 prints in each color section, you want to kind of scramble this up and pair different colors together so that you get that stripy effect in the quilt. Like if you choose 2 of these pinks and sew them together, there's not going to be a lot of variation in the stripes, and so you're going to end up with a block that looks like it's more of a solid color when we want that real stripy effect. I'm going to just go ahead and pair these up and make sure that it kind of comes out even and make myself little sets to work from. So I'm just going to take 2 strips and basically just fold them together into little packets. So I am going to continue this, and then we will sew a block. So after you have paired up all of your jelly roll strips, you are ready to make your block. So grab 2, I have a red and an orange here, and a sharp pair of scissors. You will not need your rotary cutter or anything until later in the process. So I'm going to align the selvages of my jelly roll strips, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way down the very long side of this. Now, as you're sewing, be careful not to stretch your jelly roll strips, especially stretching one more than the other. Jelly roll strips are very rarely cut exactly on the straight of grain, which means that these are slightly biased edges, which means that jelly roll strips do have a little bit of stretch to them. So just be wary of that. You can actually use, if your jelly roll strip has these little, if it has these little pinked edges, then you can actually kind of align those 2 pinked edges as kind of a marker of keeping them together. So you don't want kind of one set of triangles to be stretching further than the other. So I just keep an eye on that as I'm sewing and make sure that I'm not tugging on one more than the other. I don't pin my jelly roll strips as I sew them. I just kind of sew a section, and then I slip my fingers between the jelly rolls and just kind of use that to align them. And so I will align this edge, and I'll kind of put my finger here to hold them and kind of act as a pin, and then I will sew until I meet my finger. And then I'll do it again. I'll just align the next section, make sure I'm not stretching one more than the other, and sew. So I have my long strips all sewn together along this edge. The next step is we are going to fold this strip in half. So I have the fold here, I just put it around my finger, and I have all the selvages aligned right here. So I'm going to take this and just kind of align the selvages. So you can see that my orange jelly roll strip was just a little bit longer than my red jelly roll strip. And that's okay. Even in the same manufacturer, strips can be different sizes like this. So we sewed these together before trimming off the selvage edge precisely because of this, so that we just have to make one cut. So I'm going to hold these even and just take my scissors and cut across. And I am just eyeballing a straight line here. If you have a printed selvage, then you might be able to use that line between like the white selvage and where the print begins. But if you're using solid or you just really can't tell, then just eyeball it. Just a nice straight line. So keep a hold of this cut after you snip it, because we're just going to take these strips and kind of walk our hands down to the fold. And here it is. And then we are going to cut that fold. Snip. So after you snip these, you have two identical pieces. There is one strip set, orange and red, and the other one is just the same. So now you just line up your strip sets and make sure that you are sewing two different fabrics together. We're going to sew along this edge, just aligning them just as we did before. And I am just going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew all the way along this roughly 20-inch segment. So we finished sewing this 1/4 inch seam that results in our kind of 4-stripe sequence. Now I'm not going to open this up yet. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it. I'm going to bring the two cut edges together and line them up so that it's nice and flat. I'm just going to put it down on my cutting mat, and then I'm going to take this, I'm just going to kind of give it a little bit of a yank so that this all lines up really nicely. You want this edge to be lined up and this edge to be roughly lined up so that we have a nice straight fold here. And then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to slip it in, making sure I get between all of the layers here. And I'm just going to snip this again. And you have to kind of fight with those seam allowances a little bit, but just give it a nice straight cut. And now we can open these up. And it gives us two 4-stripe blocks. And we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to flip one of them over and sew it together so that you're sewing the alternate colors together. So I'm going to sew the orange to the red. And again, I'm not going to pin, I'm just going to hold these as evenly as I can and sew a 1/4 inch seam along this edge. And that's it. That's our finished block. It's roughly 10 inches across by 16.5 inches tall. And when I say roughly 10 inches across, we are going to trim this block down so that it is exactly 10 inches. And this is because not all jelly roll strips are the same. Remember when we cut our selvages off, how one orange strip was longer than the red strip? That's because even in the same manufacturer, even in the same product line, like these are all Kona solids, and they were all bundled together by the manufacturer, but that doesn't mean that they were all exactly the same width. So when a manufacturer says 40 to 42 inches, they're telling the truth, because not all fabrics are going to be exactly 40 inches. So that means in our finished block, that little bit of variation in the jelly roll width is going to mean that our blocks are, some of them might be 10.25, some might be 10.5, but we are going to take advantage of that little bit of extra length to take care of these slightly jagged edges and make sure that they're all exactly 10 inches. So I'm going to press this block and then make 19 more. So I have finished making all of my blocks and they are all pressed. This block is about 10.5 inches wide, but some of these blocks might be just barely over 10 or 10 1/4. So I do need to trim these all down to a uniform size. Now, if you go through all of yours and they all measure 10.5 or more, then you can feel free to trim yours down to 10.5. But mine, I feel a little bit safer just trimming them down to 10 and taking the potential loss of a little bit of width in the block. Now I do this one at a time for each block, just so I know that they're all staying pretty straight and true. So I have all of my blocks trimmed down to straight sides at 10 inches. And I didn't trim the length because they should be pretty consistent. Like if your seam allowances are the same, we know that these strips were all the same because they came from the same jelly roll. So these should be fairly consistent from block to block. So I'm not going to worry about the height as much. So let's talk about layout options. Now I have assembled my blocks in a rainbow, kind of coming from that rainbow jelly roll. And so I want to lay out my blocks kind of in that same rainbow order. I have a design wall in my sewing room now that I just added, but I didn't always have one. And so this is how I laid out blocks in kind of a limited amount of space. The key here is to fold your blocks into a smaller kind of version of themselves, but one that you can still see all of the colors or prints that are present in the block. And that will allow you to kind of make decisions about placement without having the entire block showing at one time. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to eventually go for a 5x4 layout, 5 across, because the blocks are only 10 inches wide. So I'm going to do 5 across and 4 up. So I'm just going to overlap these a little bit so I have a little bit more room this way. And I'm just folding them and putting them down. We'll kind of worry about exact placement once we have them all where we can see them. So this is how the quilt will be laid out, 5 blocks by 4 rows. And now I just kind of take a look and see, is there anything that kind of sticks out to me? And I think this block over here really needs to be closer over here. So I'm just going to take this one. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with this layout. Now it's just time to stack these up and keep them organized for sewing. So what I do is grab some pins and I'm going to stack up the rows with the leftmost block on top. And I just keep them folded as they were. I can unfold them as I'm sewing. So this is row 1. This is the top left corner of row 1. And so I'm going to put 1 pin in it. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the second row. This is row 2, so it gets 2 pins. And then as I assemble the row and I come back to put the rows together, these pins will be kind of right where I'm pinning the rows together. So I'll just slide them out and use them to pin the rows. But until then, they're just a nice little marker for what row comes next. And so I don't lose track of what the leftmost block is. And this is most important when you're dealing with prints. Like, it's pretty obvious to me because I laid these out in rainbow order where each one would go. But if I'm working with prints and I want to keep them kind of random looking, then it's important to know kind of what is the left side of your row. So here we are, row 4. Four pins. So I'm just going to take these over to my sewing machine, and when I'm at my sewing machine, I'll put these to the left of my machine. I'll pick this one up, put it down, and then pick the second one up and put it face down. And once these are sewn together, then I'll open it up and pick up the next one, put it face down here, and just kind of create my row that way. And this pin will always be in the top left, so I'll know which side I'm adding to as I create my row. So I'm going to get these rows sewn together, and then we'll sew our rows together. So I'm at my sewing machine ready to sew my first row, and I wanted to take a minute and just talk about nesting these seams. Now, because there are so many seams in this block that are going to nest like this, I'm not going to bother pinning this block. And the way I pressed these blocks is I just did it randomly because I wasn't all that concerned about the orientation of the block. Now, if you are and you want them to nest, then you're going to have to decide on your layout before you press your block so that you can be sure to press one in one direction and then press the other one in the correct orientation so that these seams come together and nest just like that. And that's going to give you that really nice striped block effect where when you open this up, your stripes are going to perfectly line up. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this entire row together, and then I might even finish all the rows. And then we'll come back when it's time to sew the rows together to create the final quilt top. So I'm just using my fingers to kind of feel that nesting of these two seams here. And then I'm just going to hold my finger on them and sew just until the needle crosses that thread line. And then I'm going to grab the next seam and make sure it nests and then repeat all the way down the block. And then I open it up and repeat. Now, let's see, these seams are facing down towards me. So I want to make sure this block, the seams are facing up, and that will help them nest. So I'm ready to start row 2. You can see my 2 pins are right here in the corner. So I'm going to grab this top one and start sewing them together. So remember back when I said that because all of your strips were the same size, it didn't matter if they were exactly 2.5 inches or if they were, 2.6 or even more if they were 3-inch strips that you were cutting from yardage. That as long as they were the same size, it didn't matter, but you had to keep consistent seam allowances. So I just want to show you how I didn't do that. So I've actually been sewing a lot in my living room where my kids are because we're all on lockdown right now and it's kind of the only place I have that I can sew all day. So I actually sewed all but one of the blocks at that sewing machine. And then I sewed this block for you guys at my normal sewing machine. And obviously my seam allowances were very different because I just tried to sew these together. So let's align these top corners and then follow the seam line down and look at how much bigger this block is than its friend. I mean, that's like a solid inch that was eaten up in these much larger seam allowances than on these narrower seam allowances on my other machine. So if you consistently move between machines, like if you have a travel machine that you take to your guild meetings, or if you're like me and you have 2 machines set up in your house, then be sure that your seam allowances are consistent from machine to machine. It's definitely something to keep in mind because I am left now with one block that is a good inch shorter than the rest. And thankfully, I can simply rip this block apart and resew it on the other machine. But now that I've started assembly on this machine, I need to complete assembly on this machine so that my blocks all line up. So it's just a little lesson here. I'm gonna rip this block out, redo it, and then finish sewing the rows together, and then we'll be able to assemble the quilt. All of my rows are sewn together. Now, I still have my pins in the corner, as you can see, and that just helps me remember which row is which. Obviously, on this quilt, it's pretty obvious since it's in rainbow order, but for the other quilt I made that I was trying to really disperse all the colors, this was really handy to have. So, As I finished these rows, I pressed these seams, and on even numbered rows, I pressed my seam allowances this way, and on odd number rows, like 3, I pressed them this way, so that the seam allowances will nest as I sew the rows together, which is what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to sew all 4 of these rows together, and then we will see the 2 finished quilt tops. So that's it, our quilt top is complete. Now this is my first version of the quilt, and I will insert a little shot right here of what the whole quilt looks like. And it is bright and fun. This line is called Betty's Luncheonette, Betty's Diner, something like that. It's from Violet Craft, and it's super fun, super bright. I love all these little fruits. So that's this version, and let me swap to the other version. And here is my super bright, happy rainbow version. It starts with pinks, reds, and oranges, and all the way down to the bottom is the purple. And here's the big shot for you guys. These quilts came together super fast. I made the first version in a day, and I made all the blocks for this one in a day and assembled it the following day. So it just takes a couple of hours, and it uses up just the one jelly roll, so you don't need extra fabric to finish it. You can just kind of whip it out. So that's it. It's just a super quick tutorial. I don't even think I'm going to do a PDF download for this one because it's so simple. It's just sewing that long seam, folding, cutting, sewing it again. So you end up with these great colorful blocks, and I think it'd look great in any fabric line. So coming soon to the channel, I have a scrappy quilt pattern that I think is going to be a lot of fun, and I'm also working on a fat quarter pattern because I know that was requested by several of you. So happy quilting, stay safe, wash your hands, do all the things that you should be doing. Oh my god.